Hey, we have a good group here. Good evening, friends. My name is Bailey. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a white woman with gray and brown hair wearing black rimmed glasses, a gray sweater, and red earrings. I'm the Chief Advancement Officer for the ACLU of Minnesota. Welcome to the ACLU of Minnesota's Back to School Town Hall, and thank you all for taking the time to be here in community with us. Today, we will be hearing from community member and activist Nikki Cruz Dye, who will speak about her personal experience with the book ban and how it activated her. We will also be hearing from Legal Director Terry Nelson, who will give an overview of students' First Amendment rights and the rights of immigrant and BIPOC students specifically. Staff Attorney Catherine All-In Halverson will speak about the rights of LGBTQ plus students and the trends we've been seeing with school boards. Finally, the Director of Advocacy, Julio Azalea, will touch on the important piece of what you can do today to protect the rights of every student in Minnesota. Some light housekeeping before we dive in. On your screen, please locate the Q&A symbol. This is how you're going to pop questions into the chat for the panelists. And we have time set aside at the end of this webinar to answer those questions, but we won't be answering them during the presentations. And with that, let us begin.
Nikki, just before you start off, if we'll actually, you can just start us off. We don't need our slide presentation while you do, although here it is, so we can use it.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm glad that you're all here tonight. My name is Nikki Cruz Dye, she, her pronouns. I am wearing scrubs because I have to go to work at 7 p.m. So I will have to leave this chat before it's over, unfortunately. But I'm a parent in the St. Francis ISD 15 school district, and maybe you've already heard, maybe you haven't, but last year our school board passed a policy to make it easier to ban books. And I've wrote everything down, so bear with me because I didn't want to miss any important parts to this saga, this great odyssey. So, in November of last year, something quietly but profoundly dangerous happened in our district. The school board passed a policy that took away the professional authority of our media specialists, the trained librarians who understand literature, education, and child development, and handed it to a website called BookLooks. If you've never heard of BookLooks, it was an unregulated, now defunct Moms for Liberty affiliated website. It allowed anyone without any credentials, training, or even basic literary standards, literacy standards, to submit so-called book reports. These reviews often included out-of-context quotes, cherry-picked pages, or even copied summaries from online sources. Based on these unqualified reports, BookLooks gave a rating from 1 to 5. Under the new policy, any book rated a 3 or higher would either be removed from our libraries or not purchased at all. Not because professionals deemed it inappropriate, not because parents discussed it through a fair and transparent process, but because of anonymous, uneducated opinions on a partisan website. At the time, many of us, myself included, were not paying close enough attention. We assumed our elected board members were acting in good faith with our students' and community's best interests at heart, but they weren't. Our board had been infiltrated by outside political influences, the Minnesota Parents Alliance, and members of the local Republican Party political operating unit. Two men began showing up at every single meeting. Neither of them have children or grandchildren in our district, yet they spoke as if they represented us all. They pushed exclusionary, fear-based Christian nationalist talking points, and the board listened to them. They didn't listen to teachers, they didn't listen to parents, they didn't listen to students, and so the book ban passed. I didn't know any of this was happening until I saw a Facebook post from Education Minnesota, because remember, I trusted them to do the right thing. I remember sitting there scrolling through my feed and feeling this jolt of disbelief and anger. I thought, how did I miss this? How did we all miss this? That same day, I emailed the school board. I wrote in again in January. A few members responded with supportive words saying they agreed with my concerns, but others sent back the usual talking points, out of context book quotes that sounded like they came straight from a Moms for Liberty meeting. In February, I learned there were now more than 30 books on the list for removal. I was furious. I wrote in again, this time with an unmistakable tone of anger and disappointment. One board member replied and encouraged me to attend the next meeting if I wanted to be heard. At first, I wasn't sure how to engage with my school board. I'm just a parent. I'm not a politician. I'm not an activist. But I decided that staying silent wasn't an option anymore, so I showed up. At that meeting, I met a community member named Barb Anderson who connected me with Catherine from the ACLU. And that single act of connection changed everything. I reached out to her, and after a long conversation, I made the decision to sign on as a plaintiff in the lawsuit, not just for myself, but for my children and for every student in this district who deserve access to a full and honest education. I didn't realize at the time that I would be the only plaintiff. That realization hit me hard. I was scared, not just of what might happen legally, but of how my own neighbors might react. I had seen these groups I have seen what these groups were saying online, the threats, the insults, the hate. I wondered what they might do in real life. But fear didn't stop me. It lit a fire under me. I made it my mission to find allies. Anyone in my community who believed in public education, in free access to books, in truth. I started posting everywhere I could think of. Reddit, Blue Sky, TikTok, Facebook, any place I could think of. That's when I met Taslyn Magnuson. She's a book ban expert from PEN America. She became a mentor, a lifeline, and a source of endless encouragement. With her help, I learned how to organize so much about the anatomy of a book ban, why they happen and what it means when they happen, how they impact learning, and how to fight them. I started combing through the local Facebook groups, reading every post about the book ban. Most were filled with misinformation and manufactured outrage, but hidden in those threads were brave souls, people who dared to speak up in opposition. I messaged them privately, and one by one, I found my people. I created a private Facebook group so we could all talk freely, plan safely, and add others who felt the same way. That small group grew quickly, and today there are about 250 members of my local community within my school district who all have similar aligned values. I had 1 month to prepare for the next school board meeting. The ACLU and Education Minnesota lawsuits were scheduled to be filed on that same morning, and I knew we had to make a big statement. And boy, we did. Over 200 community members came out to a rally and press conference before the meeting. We carried signs and wore shirts I designed so there would be no mistake about who we were and what we stood for. Students, many of whom had organized a walkout that very morning, spoke about their right to read and to think for themselves. Authors, invited by Taslyn, gave powerful testimonies, and for more than an hour and a half, our voices filled that school board room. It was electric. I know Catherine was there, and I know she felt it too. In the months that followed, the school board refused to comment publicly on the lawsuits or the policy, but we didn't stop. We showed up to every single meeting. We wrote emails, we gave speeches, we caused what John Lewis called good trouble. These groups trying to undermine public education are relentless, but so are we. We made sure that every meeting went long because they had to sit there and listen to us. They couldn't ignore us anymore. I was still afraid, especially after seeing the hate that spread on social media. But you know what I learned? They're cowards. They shout online, but very few of them are brave enough to show up in person and state what they believe. In June, we had a settlement meeting. The pressure worked. From the lawsuits, from the media attention, from hundreds of community members who refused to back down, the board caved. The books were returned to the shelves, and the policy cannot be changed for 3 years. That is a huge victory. It came at a cost, a bad reputation for our school district, and 49 books were placed under review. One of those 49 books was submitted by a parent. The other 48 of those, the other 48 of those books by one of those two men I told you about at the beginning of this story. 11 books were ultimately removed, including Out of Darkness, The Kite Runner, The Handmaid's Tale, The Perks of Being a Wallflower, The Bluest Eyes, and others. Even Night by Elie Wiesel, a book about the Holocaust, was targeted. So I've made it my mission to read every single book that was on our banned list because it's really important to me to know exactly why they are so afraid of these books. That's how far this ideology goes. Banning books about the Holocaust. That's how far this ideology goes. Out of this ordeal, something unexpected and beautiful has grown, a community. Now, when I go to the grocery store or attend a school event, I see people who smile at me, people I know are safe, people who share the same values of truth, compassion, and education. Our group continues to meet monthly. We talk about what's happening in the district. We strategize for the 2026 school board election when two of our allies' terms will expire, and we plan to replace the member who proudly voted for the book ban. We also watch very closely to see what our school board is up to and what's happening in our community, and we make sure and email our school board when we see problems, and we email them when we see them doing good things because they also need positive reinforcement along with hearing about the negative things. We're also reaching outward. I had a dream of connecting all of the grassroots groups across Minnesota that are fighting back against the same forces, the same disinformation, the same political infiltration into our schools. And I met Chris Birault at the first school board meeting where we had our rally. He's my neighbor and he works for Outfront Minnesota. He has the experience to make my dream of connecting all of these groups a reality. Together, we're building a network to connect, train, and support community groups across the state. No one should have to start from scratch like I did. No one should have to do this alone. And now I tell my story online. I use TikTok for now to help people learn how to engage with their school boards, how to find their allies, how to recognize when something is being taken from them quietly under the guise of protecting children. Because this isn't just about books, it's about democracy. It's about trust. It's about our children's right to learn, to question, and to imagine. This past year has changed me. I used to think activism belonged to other people, the ones with more time, more knowledge, more confidence. But I learned that sometimes all it takes to start a movement is one person saying, I've had enough. And once you find your people, once you build that community, there's no going back. That's all. It's not 15 minutes.
It exactly is. So, thank you, Nikki. It has been an honor working with you and an honor being part of this movement in St. Francis. And, I really appreciate you sharing your story here tonight. Um, so I'm, as Haley said, I'm Catherine Allen Halverson. I am a white woman wearing big brown glasses with light brown hair. And I am a staff attorney here at the ACLU of Minnesota, and had the honor of representing Nikki and another family in the St. Francis lawsuit that helped to return those books to shelves. And so now that Nikki has introduced us to what it looks like to experience an attack on learning at your school board in your school district and to respond to it, we are going to move on to talking about knowing your rights, knowing what they are, so you know when you might be losing them, and then what you can watch for and do about it. And so I think we're moving on to Terry is going to start us off with respect to the First Amendment.
Thank you, Catherine. And thank you, Nikki. You are an inspiration, and it has been an honor to work with you and keep up the amazing work. Good evening. My name is Teresa Nelson. I go by Terry. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a white woman with blonde hair clipped in a bun and wearing black and silver cat's eye glasses. And thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm going to start our student rights portion of the program with a mini primer on student speech rights. Next slide, Haley. Next, okay, there we go. The first big case or landmark case on student speech rights is Tinker v. Des Moines Independent Community School District. And that was a U.S. Supreme Court decision from 1969. Mary Beth Tinker and her brother wore black armbands to school to protest the Vietnam War, and they were disciplined for it. Their case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in its decision, the court reminded us that, quote, students do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate, end quote. The court also held that student speech is protected unless it's reasonably likely to materially disrupt classwork or it involves substantial disorder or invasion of the rights of others. That's a pretty high standard, right, for schools to be able to censor student speech. And what this means is that students have the right to speak in school, but schools do have the ability to restrict speech if it interferes with classroom activities or other workings of the school, or it impinges on the rights of other students. Next slide. So fast forward, there have been a number of other student speech cases. And the bottom line is that schools do have some power to regulate students and their activities in some circumstances. So the Supreme Court gives special leeway when schools regulate speech that occurs under its supervision because of the special characteristics of the school environment. So when speech and discussion takes place in a classroom or as part of the curriculum, the Supreme Court is willing to give more power to schools to regulate that kind of speech. And the rules are that the schools can regulate that speech as long as the school's actions are reasonably related to legitimate educational interests, and they're not simply punishing students because of their viewpoint. In addition to school regulating speech in the classroom and the school's education function, the Supreme Court has considered schools to be acting in the place of parents while kids are in school. And that means that they have some ability to regulate student behavior and ethics as well. So the Supreme Court has allowed schools to punish student speech that is lewd, speech that's vulgar, and speech that glorifies or promotes drug use. So in general, okay, next slide. This is kind of a text-dense slide. I believe that Ailey will be emailing the slide deck to all of the participants afterwards. So if you don't get all this, we will still get it after we are done. Students have the right to hand out flyers, petitions, wear expressive clothing, speak your mind outside the classroom, as long as you don't disrupt the functioning of the school or violate school policies that don't hinge on the message expressed. So when it comes to handing out flyers and circulating petitions, schools do have the ability to say the time and the location and the manner of that distribution. And in Minnesota, schools can even require you to submit the materials for prior review. But they have to apply the rules equally to everybody, and they can't censor materials just because they disagree with them. So if you want to hand out flyers, look at your school's rules. But again, they cannot prohibit you from handing out flyers just because they disagree with the message. Schools can also have other rules that might touch on expression as long as those rules don't have anything to do with the message expressed. And the way we see this the most common is dress codes. So the schools can prohibit you from wearing hats generally. That doesn't have any basis in what the hats say, but they can't prohibit hats that express a specific viewpoint or, ones that have political slogans or social messages because of those messages. And even schools that require school uniform still have to allow some non-disruptive student expression, such as pins or armbands or things like that. Outside of school, students have essentially the same rights to protest and speak out as anyone else. And so what that means is you're most protected if you are organizing, protesting, advocating for your views while you're off campus, outside of school hours, not having no connection with the school at all. And I'll talk more about that later because there's the most recent Supreme Court case deals with that issue. And students have the right to speak your mind on social media. Again, they have the least authority to punish content that's posted off campus outside of school hours that doesn't relate to the school. So I've talked about disruptive a few times here. What does that mean? It varies actually by context. And so, what might be disruptive in one school may not really be considered to be disruptive in another school, and it's going to vary. But one thing that does not vary is that a school that disagrees with your position or thinks that your speech is controversial or in bad taste is not enough to qualify as disruption. The Tinker decision makes it clear that schools can't prohibit speech just because they want to avoid having difficult conversations or avoid controversy. Right at the time that Mary Beth Tinker wore her armband, the protests of the Vietnam War were at their height, and there was a lot of controversy and disagreement. And yet the Supreme Court said that she had the First Amendment right to wear that armband. And fast forward, courts have upheld the ability to wear things like anti-war armbands, an armband opposing the right to get an abortion, a t-shirt supporting the LGBTQ community, and many other types of student expression that touch on controversial issues or disputed issues. Next slide. So fast forward, I started with the very first Supreme Court case on student speech, and I'm going to end the speech, end the First Amendment section with a discussion of the most recent case, which is Mahoney Area School District versus BL. It's colloquially known as the F Cheer case because the student in the case was angry at something that happened in one of her sports, one of her activities, and she sent a Snapchat off school grounds, outside of school hours, to some of her friends saying F cheer, F softball, F school, F everything. Only she spelled it out. And the school disciplined her and she sued, and it went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The court was very wary of the school's ability to regulate her off-campus speech for three really big important reasons. Number one, when students aren't on campus or at school events, the school doesn't have the same role to stand in place of parents, because when kids are off campus, that's the parents' role and their responsibility to protect, guide, and discipline kids. Number two, from the students' perspective, if schools did have the ability to regulate off-campus speech, that would mean that schools could regulate that speech 24/7, all of the student speech. And the court was really skeptical of that idea, especially with regards to political or religious speech that occurs outside of the school. And three, the court, reminded all of us that schools actually have an interest in protecting students and their unpopular expression, especially when that takes place off campus. One of the missions of schools is to prepare young people for adulthood and participation in our representative democracy. And so they should be they should be nurturing a free exchange of ideas, even when they're unpopular. Now, the court did leave open the ability for schools to regulate some speech, and even if it takes place off campus. The two examples that they mentioned are speech that targets members of the school community with vulgar or abusive language. And harassing behavior, and second, off-campus speech that causes an actual classroom disruption. So there are those circumstances. It's not that the school can never regulate off-campus speech, but it really does have to, reach the school community. Next slide. Okay, so those are primarily First Amendment rights. And I'm going to shift gears a little bit to talk about the Federal Equal Access Act, because while the First Amendment does protect students' ability to meet on school grounds during non-instructional time, to have school clubs, their rights are much stronger under the Federal Equal Access Act if it applies to your school. So the bottom line is that if a public secondary school gets federal funding, which, almost all of them do, and they allow at least one non-curricular group, they have to treat all non-curricular groups equally, and they can't deny the same opportunities or discriminate against a group based on the content of their speech. So this slide has the actual text of the Equal Access Act, and I'll break it down on the next slide. So go ahead, Haley. So again, if a public school permits a non-curricular student group, it must allow students to form their own non-curricular groups, and they must be able to have the same access and opportunities that all of the other non-curricular clubs get. So what does the Act call a non-curricular group? Curiously, it doesn't define non-curricular, but it does define curricular. And so non-curricular groups are essentially groups that aren't related to the classes taught in the school. And it's kind of like a reverse, like a negative. If a group does not meet the criteria to be a curricular group, it's a non-curricular group. So a group of students. And so the definition of a curricular group is very narrow. Subject matter has to be taught, or will soon be taught in the school. So math club, that's probably a curricular group. The subject matter contains the body of courses as a whole. So the most common example is a student government program that actually does give feedback on the body of courses. That's considered a curricular group. Or participation is required for a course, or it results in academic credit. If a student group doesn't meet those four criteria, one of those four, it's a non-curricular group, and every other non-curricular group in the school have the right to the same level of access that non-curricular group receives. So what does this mean in practical terms? Well, we had a case about this in 2008. Next slide, please. That case is Straights and Gays for Equality versus Osseo area schools. And actually, the case started a little bit earlier than 2008 because it took a few times to go up to the Eighth Circuit. But ultimately, the Maple Grove Senior High School had designated groups as curricular that the court found were actually non-curricular because they weren't taught in the school. They weren't part of a body of courses as a whole. Students didn't get credit. And those were cheerleading, synchronized swimming, Spirit Council, which was essentially a group that planned homecoming activities and dances and things like that, and Black Achievers. The court said those are actually non-curricular groups that the school district has classified as curricular and is giving sort of favored status to and favored access. Whereas the Gay Straight Alliance, SAGE, was relegated to a very small bulletin board, and they had a very difficult time recruiting members. And so the federal court said, no, you can't do that. And the district court issued a permanent injunction, and the Eighth Circuit upheld that injunction, requiring the high school to give SAGE the same access to meetings, avenues of communication, and other miscellaneous rights as they were giving to these misclassified non-curricular groups. A key takeaway from SAGE v. Osseo is that the analysis of what is curricular is very narrow. The school district had argued that both cheerleading and synchronized swimming had to be curricular because, one, they were Minnesota State High School League sponsored activities, and two, they were physical activities, so it related to gym class. But the court disagreed, and for example, they said the school doesn't even have a pool, much less a class to teach synchronized swimming. So this issue arises a lot in schools, and whether or not the Equal Access Act is being violated really does depend on the facts on the ground. So if this is an issue that you're dealing with, it's important to look at how groups are being classified, what groups are being classified as curricular versus non-curricular, how are they being treated, what is the access, and what classes are actually offered at the school. And again, the results might be different for different school districts. Future Farmers of America is probably a curricular group if the school offers agricultural courses, but probably not a curricular group if there's no ag courses in your school district. So a lot depends on what the facts are on the ground. So now I am going to turn things over to Catherine to talk about.
Great. Thank you, Terry. So I'm going to talk with you about students' LGBTQ plus rights. And I wanted to share these quilt pieces that are from something that was called the Freedom to Be Monument on the National Mall this in May. There was a huge quilt. So these are just 3 panels, and I think it may come back and make the rounds around the country. I hope we get to see it here. Okay, next slide, Haley. So I'm going to talk with you about your students' LGBTQ plus rights. I do want to start by grounding us in the current moment. With the Trump administration taking the lead, the reality is that we are in a moment of increasing attacks on LGBTQ plus students, especially transgender and non-binary students. It's possible that the landscape will change. Some of this law is evolving, but at this time, it mostly hasn't changed at all, even though there's a lot of bluster and executive orders that bluster and those executive orders have trickled down and infiltrated local politics, including, sadly, our school boards. Even though all that is true, K through 12 LGBTQ plus students in public schools continue to have robust protections in federal and Minnesota state law to express and be themselves, and to experience inclusive and equitable school environments. And so I've got a long list of things here on this slide that I'm going to walk through. The first thing is that LGBTQ plus students have the right to be protected from bullying and harassment. Minnesota has a really good law, the Safe and Supportive Schools Act, which requires that schools have a policy that protects against bullying that is based on gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. And our Minnesota Human Rights Act and our Minnesota Constitution also protect LGBTQ plus students from discrimination and harassment. LGBTQ plus students have the right to be addressed using a student's preferred name and pronouns. They have the right to self-report their gender identity, without having to provide some documentation or other evidence of their gender identity. I'm going to talk about that law a little more in a moment, but generally we have robust protection in Minnesota law for students to be respected in their gender expression and gender identity. Students have the right to express support for the LGBTQ plus community in what they wear and to dress consistent with their gender identity. Students have the right to have dress codes enforced equally, not based on stereotyping or censoring particular viewpoints, as Terry pointed out. So, for example, a dress code can't allow a cisgender girl to wear a skirt to a certain length, but disallow a cisgender boy from wearing a skirt of that same length. Those rights stem from the First Amendment, from our Minnesota Human Rights Act, and our Minnesota Constitution. Terry already talked about the Equal Access Act, and as she said, that applies to groups that form for the purpose of supporting LGBTQ plus students. Those groups are entitled to the same support as other student-formed non-curricular groups. And finally, students have the right to access books that reflect diverse characters and communities that are appropriate as a librarian or media specialist determines. That includes LGBTQ plus characters and stories. That right to learn and read is grounded in the First Amendment and our First Amendment equivalent in the Minnesota Constitution. We have a kind of special book ban statute in Minnesota that is really important. That's something that Nikki and the other plaintiffs in St. Francis invoked in their lawsuit. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. And our Human Rights Act and our Constitution. So we'll go to the next slide, please, Haley. So, as I said, there's a lot of talk out there and there are a lot of things kind of blowing around, but Minnesota law is very clear and very supportive of our transgender students. Transgender students have the right to use the same restrooms and locker rooms as other students, consistent with their gender identity. This is, a right that was established in the NH versus Anoka Hennepin case, or which was confirmed in that case in 2020. And that is a right that stems from the Minnesota Human Rights Act and our Minnesota Constitution. And transgender students have the right to participate in school activities and on teams in a way that aligns with their gender identity. Now, we have a lot of things happening with the Federal Department of Education and demands that they're making to, kind of enforce President Trump's executive orders around gender identity. But where we are today is that the Minnesota Attorney General has looked at the Minnesota State High School League policy, which requires and allows that students be allowed to play consistent with their gender identity. And our Attorney General's opinion says, yes, that is what's required of the Human Rights Act here in Minnesota. And so that's where we are. I'll talk a little bit more about some of what's going on around this issue when we're talking about what's happening on school boards. We'll go to the next slide, Haley. Thank you. And I just wanted to touch on the fact that LGBTQ plus students have a right to privacy in a number of respects that I think it's important to know about. Students have the right to ask that a school keep their sexual orientation and gender identity private if that's what they want. And that right stems from, we call it FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and our Minnesota Government Data Practices Act. And so, if a student is in a situation where, they have a teacher who is kind of casually, incorrectly using their, addressing them by name or pronoun, and that's revealing their transgender status, which they've wanted to keep private, that can be a violation of FERPA and the Government Data Practices Act. And if creating a hostile environment for a student, if it's part of harassment or discrimination against a transgender student, it could be a violation of the Minnesota Human Rights Act as well. FERPA also gives students the right to know of individuals, agencies, and organizations that have requested the student's personal information from the student's school. So that's a right that every student has. So that's where I'm going to stop for now. But that gives you a little overview of some of the important rights that LGBTQ students have. And I'm going to turn it back to Terry.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to talk briefly. I know we do want to have time for questions, and it looks like there's some really good deep questions in the Q&A already. But yeah, so students, first of all, BIPOC students, Black, Indigenous, people of color, all have the right to an equal education free from discrimination and censorship. And so what does that look like? Well, first of all, it means that schools don't have racially biased disciplinary policies and practices, and schools really need to eliminate those. Where we see this happen often is that Black students are disciplined for conduct that white students do not receive the same discipline for. And if you look at discipline rates in Minnesota, the Department of Education has those rates for every school district. We see wide disparities in who is being disciplined and who is not. Schools should adopt an inclusive curriculum that acknowledges their experiences. Those are things that are required by the right to equal protection, the constitutional right to equal protection, to have an education that reflects your experiences and is not discriminatory. But it's also in our state laws for curriculum. And then lastly, schools have a responsibility. This is not an exhaustive list, but schools have a responsibility to address and remedy hostile school environments. Now, there is a fine line between a student's First Amendment protected speech and abusive speech that amounts to bullying and harassment. And, sometimes that line is not clear. And again, that line might be different depending on the school district. But schools do have a responsibility to address those situations where student speech has risen to the level of creating a hostile school environment for students, especially if it's based on that student's membership in a protected class, such as race, religion, gender identity, or sexual orientation. And so when it rises to that level of creating a hostile environment, or it interferes with the student's ability to learn, that kind of speech can and should be addressed by schools. And BIPOC students, all students who are members of protected classes, have a right to an equal education that does not take place in a hostile school environment. Next slide, please. I'm sorry. One other thing on the previous slide, we don't have to go back, is that there is an Eighth Circuit precedent on this issue. It's BWA versus Farmington R7 School District. That's Farmington, Missouri, not Farmington, Minnesota. But the court allowed a school to ban clothing bearing the Confederate flag, and that ban took place after there had been several racially charged incidents in the school and in the community. And the court concluded that even though the government generally can't ban display of the Confederate flag, it's protected speech, in the context of the educational setting, and at a time and in a context where the officials reasonably anticipate that there's going to be disruption, that kind of a ban was permissible on school grounds. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the rights of immigrant students. Just like BIPOC students, immigrant students have the right to an equal education that's free from discrimination and censorship. And the main case on this, the main Supreme Court case, is from 1982, and it's called Plyler versus Doe. In that case, a Texas law prohibited immigrant children without legal status from attending public school. And the Supreme Court held that that law violated the children's rights to equal protection because the state couldn't identify any substantial state interest to justify the burden on these children. The state, purported an interest of saving money, and the court, shot that down, saying, that's not going to save you money. And even if it does, it's a negligible amount, and it does not outweigh the interests of these children to an education. So that's a really important case. Next slide, please. So essentially, both free speech laws against bullying and laws that prohibit bullying and harassment, just like those laws apply to BIPOC kids, apply to students who don't have immigration status. And when there's a family who doesn't have immigration status, they still have a right to public school, and the right to go to that public school. Now, Minnesota does sometimes ask parents who are enrolling students to provide a birth certificate or a social security card, but they're not doing that to check immigration status. They're doing it for another purpose, right? So for most new kids enrolling in school, they want to figure out what is the child's age, where is the appropriate placement, not their immigration status. Next slide. So bottom line, both immigrant students and BIPOC students, schools can't discriminate against them on the basis of race, color, or national origin. Undocumented kids can't be denied the right to a free public education. And students with limited English proficiency also can't be turned away by public schools. They must provide them with language instruction. And next slide. I'm going to close out the student rights discussion with a few recommendations when students are interacting with law enforcement. A lot of schools have school resource officers. Students might be interacting with law enforcement outside of school. I'm going to preface this with a couple of caveats. First of all, this is very high level. We do have some more detailed Know Your Rights and with regard to interactions with law enforcement on our website. The National ACLU has a bunch of them as well. So if you have questions, I encourage you to take a look at those. Also, we recognize that people encountering police are not responsible to de-escalate the police. Their job is to de-escalate tense situations. So when we say don't in here, don't do this, don't do that, it's really a way of us saying these are things that are a bad idea and will likely make the situation escalate. But there may also be times when there's nothing you can do to de-escalate, and nothing you can do to have your rights respected by police. And so when that happens, try to make a record of it and keep notes and things like that. So moving on, if you're stopped by the police, it's best to stay calm. Don't argue or resist or run away, or otherwise physically interfere with the officer. You can ask if you're free to leave. And if the answer is yes, walk away. That is the best thing that you can do in that situation. If you're asked questions, if the officer asks you a question, you do have the right to remain silent, but you have to articulate that right. You have to say, I don't want to talk to you. I want to remain silent. And if you keep talking, you're going to waive those rights. And anything that you say, anything that you write or sign can then be used against you. So if you do choose to make a statement and talk to law enforcement, it's always good to have a lawyer present or a parent or guardian. And students have the right to have a lawyer or a parent or guardian present when they're questioned. You can refuse to give your consent to be searched by the police. Now, that's not going to necessarily stop them from searching you, but it is the best way to protect your rights, to prevent things if you end up in court. Again, if you're refusing consent, don't physically resist, because that can constitute a new crime. So refuse to consent, don't physically interfere, and, just make that refusal known. Also good idea to not consent to a phone search. Police typically need a warrant to search your phone. And the same goes for a strip search. No police officer or school employee has the authority to strip search you. Again, last thing, don't resist, fight, or flee from an officer who's arresting you. Even if it's an unlawful arrest, you don't have the right to physically resist. Say you wish to remain silent and ask for a lawyer immediately. Don't say anything or sign anything or make any decisions without a lawyer present. So again, we've got more detailed information on our website, but I did want to kind of cover a few of those things. And now I'm going to turn it back to Catherine.
Thanks, Terry. It just occurred to me to mention that we also have some good information on our website about students and schools' rights with respect to ICE, and some good Know Your Rights information that's specific to ICE, which is a little different from this law enforcement Know Your Rights information. So now we're going to talk a little bit about, moving from a general discussion about our rights to how we're seeing rights attacked at the school board and school district level. So I'm going to talk about trends on extremist school boards. Although the politicization of school boards and this current movement, it does predate the current presidential administration. We can't talk about what's happening today without acknowledging the Trump administration's attack on education. Next slide. Since January, we have seen an unprecedented attack against public schools, executive orders threatening to terminate federal funding to schools that have DEI programs, teach about racism, bias, and gender ideology as they define it, as they have schools that work to remedy the racial disparities in discipline that Terry was talking about, that allow transgender students to participate in school consistent with their gender identity. And I think the important thing is to recognize that most of this is really existing in orders that don't have the force of law, and most of it's also in litigation, to the extent that the Department of Education has been invoking these orders to threaten to terminate school funding. And so we're really focusing, and I think it's important in advocacy to a school board to focus on what is law, what are your rights that are established, and I think a good response to some of this is that that's getting sorted out in courts and administrative proceedings. And so today, I think it's very reasonable and appropriate to assert the rights that are established that you have under Minnesota law. And so that's what we'll talk about then how that comes up and what to do. So next slide, please. So we have this unprecedented local attacks against Minnesota public schools. They're popping up everywhere. You heard Nikki talk about St. Francis. And here are just a few examples. Hundreds of students at Maple Grove Senior High opting out of an LGBTQ plus history lesson last year. Stillwater School District removing books from elementary school library shelves. Hastings and Prior Lake, Savage school boards repealing equity and inclusion policies, and Forest Lake School Board. I think we might have some folks from that community on this call. I don't know, the list is very long, so this is just a small sample and it's increasing. And so what we want to do is now just talk about what these attacks, how they come up. Because as Nikki mentioned, sometimes when it's buried in a new policy that's being considered, it's hard to identify that attack on students' rights, as it's developing. So Haley, you can go to the next slide, please. So this first one is book bans and book removals. So, the ways that you might hear about this at a school board meeting or in your community is hearing that your school board is revising or drafting their library materials policy, which is, being drafted. Usually it's called 606.5, and that is a policy that might be revised just to comply with the book ban statute. When it is being revised in a way that it is going to lead to censorship, book removal, book bans, there's usually language that's limiting the librarian's independence and expanding the school board's oversight over materials. So that's something to watch for. Another thing you might notice is that you're seeing reports in the school board materials at a school board meeting of increasing numbers of successful challenges to library books to remove the books from libraries or classrooms. Under the book ban statute, a school has to report when books are challenged and removed from library shelves. And so that is something that you can track and that you can ask about if it's not being reported at school board meetings, because these are reports that are required. You might just hear that this has happened in Stillwater. An employee just went and unilaterally removed books from shelves, and it didn't happen at the school board level. So that might be something that you hear about in the community, or you might hear people talking about it during a public comment period at your school board meeting. And you might hear, people at your school board meeting commenting and demanding books being removed. Maybe what you're hearing is a movement from the other side pressuring school board members to censor books. And so there are a number of legal authorities. One is this book ban statute, which is a recent law in Minnesota that says that a public library, including a school library, cannot ban, remove, or otherwise restrict access to a book or other material based solely on its viewpoint or the messages, ideas, or opinions it conveys. And there are a lot of procedural protections in book ban statutes. So if that's an issue that's coming up for you, we will have a lot of resources about that. And then there are also rights that flow from the Constitution: the freedom of speech, freedom to learn, freedom to read, the right to a general and uniform system of public education. So that's a little bit. I wish I could talk all night about this, but I'm just going to touch on each of these. So next slide, please, Haley. This is a really complex issue, and so I'm going to try to do it really quickly. Opt-outs. Under Minnesota law, parents may review the content of instructional materials and opt their child out of specific content by making reasonable arrangements for alternative instruction. So our opt-out statute envisions that if a family has a particular, perspective on something, they can ask to review curriculum, identify the thing in the curriculum that is concerning to them, and then ask to have their child opt out, and really be the leader about alternative instruction. The school can provide it, but they don't have to. And so that's what the law is providing. There's a tension with opt-outs, like what Terry was talking about with the First Amendment and hostile environments. A school needs to administer opt-out requests in a manner that does not create a discriminatory environment for students based on their race, religion, national origin, sex, gender identity, status with regard to public assistance, sexual orientation, or disability, because those are protected classes under our Human Rights Act. And so what you can watch for in your school district is, groups of parents seeking global opt-outs from specific representation, in curriculum and books, often LGBTQ plus representation. So they're not going through and they're not doing this on a personal level of, with respect to their kid and reviewing the curriculum, but it's a big request from a lot of people. Or you might see a school board and your administrators removing books to accommodate these like broad opt-out requests, which is not appropriate. It's not appropriate to remove the right to learn from other kids because somebody wants to exercise their right under the opt-out statute. And you want to watch for a school district accommodating hundreds of opt-outs without requiring parents to review curriculum and make alternative instruction, because that might really harm kids who are left behind, who are part of the community that's being objected to in the materials. And I put, it's really small, but the way you might notice this in your community is that somebody is recruiting people to opt out. So here's a form that was on a website in Stillwater, trying to get people to sign an opt-out form and check boxes to ask to be opted out of curriculum around learning about sexuality and gender identity and gender expression. So this is, the way the opt-out statute might get twisted into something that's violating the Human Rights Act. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, watch for your school board rescinding DEI efforts or trying to change the curriculum to remove diverse history, anti-racist, material, and so I just want to kind of give you a little groundwork. The Trump administration did issue this Dear Colleague letter directing states to certify their compliance with anti-discrimination obligations by eliminating DEI programs. And this is a threat to remove federal funding. But 3 judges have issued preliminary stays and injunctions of those requirements. And meanwhile, our Minnesota legislature sets academic standards, and school districts have to adopt curriculum that meets those standards. And so when our Minnesota legislature says you have to have, ethnic studies in your social studies curriculum, that stands. And again, we live in the under the Minnesota Human Rights Act and our Constitution, which prohibit discrimination and harassment. So there is legal authority to stand on to oppose and challenge your school board rescinding diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, eliminating DEI positions, terminating district leaders who are pursuing anti-racist or inclusive curriculum, or refusing to adopt curriculum that complies with the state mandated academic standards. Next slide, please. Okay, and then another trend to watch for is I'm sort of calling it anti-inclusion actions. So these are just all the things that are out there. School boards restricting the ability to form affinity clubs, and we've talked a lot about what that looks like under the Equal Access Act. School boards wanting to roll back or refuse to adopt gender inclusion policies. School boards, seeking to exclude participation in sports consistent with gender identity in the name of compliance with the demands from the Federal Department of Education. And so when you see these things happening in your school district, they are really complex right now, but they're not because, we have really clear law, as I talked about earlier, in Minnesota that supports the right of transgender students to an equal education and a community that's free from discrimination, and that includes the right to participate consistent with gender identity. There is a movement right now that's happening in response to an investigation that, as I said, that Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights investigation findings against inclusive policies in Minnesota. And that is in an administrative proceeding right now. And so it's not law. It's just something that's being sorted out between the federal government and our state system. And while that's happening, what our schools are obligated to do is follow the law as it stands. And I think that's a very reasonable position to push with your school board and in your community, and really demand of your school district. So I know that's like just a drop. Oh, and here's my last one, which Nikki mentioned this. Next slide, Haley, please. Watch for your school board doing a good job. And if they're doing that, if you see that people are demanding them to do something negative and they don't do it, it's a great thing to use your voice to support them, to stand up, say, yes, this is what we want you to be doing, because it makes them feel good and appreciated. And also it tells them that the community cares, and it's a way of having your voice be heard. It's really important because there are a lot of voices asking school boards to limit students' rights right now. And so now that's what we've got so far. Those are some introductions to some of the things that are happening out there. And before I turn it over to Julio, I just wanted to acknowledge, that as he talks to you about what next steps can be and school board watch, that we're really lucky to have so many great organizations as partners and in our community doing really important work alongside us with school boards, including Outfront Minnesota and PRISM and the School Board Integrity Project. And we're just so excited. And Nikki, who's her own organization. And so we're just really excited to see what happens as people get more involved. So with that, I'll turn it over to Julio.
Thank you, Catherine, Nikki, Terry, for all you're bringing today. I'm just looking outside, and it can only be described as a quintessential fall, and to many of you, the start of a new year. So just thank you for being here. It really means a lot for you, for your community, and for us at the ACLU. Thank you for being here. My name is Julio Zelaya. I'm a Latino man. I'm wearing a black t-shirt and glasses, and for a few more days, a beard. Listen, we've been together for about over an hour now, and I just want to pause and have you think about why you are here. Maybe it was just to hear speakers, maybe it was just to get some more information, to hear a little bit of more law, but I'm willing to guess that you're here for something, or maybe someone. And if you're thinking of that someone, envision their face. Think about that person you're here for. Feel free to say their name. This is the person that we want to take action for. And maybe that person is you. Haley, can you go next? We want you to take action for the people in your community, for yourself, for maybe that better world you want to work on. And there's many ways to do this. Today, we're happening to focus on schools, and more particularly school boards. It can be summarized, this whole presentation can be summarized in a way that's saying that all politics is local. And I've heard it say that many people say that the most local you can get is a school board. I would actually venture to say that the most local you can get is yourself, right? We are political, and thus we are all activists. And so, while there's many ways to impact our community, this campaign that we're launching today for the Freedom to Learn is really going to focus on school boards and with you on your school board. And we'd like you to join us. So, like Nikki, we're invited you to take action. And we'll start at home at your school by understanding really how they do business. And they do it through their local unit of government called their school board. Next. So let's say you want to attend a school board. Well, you can. It's their public meetings. We invite you to check out your school board, where you can find where they meet and when they meet by going online. It's usually a simple way of going about it. Every district has their agendas and their meetings made public as they adhere to Minnesota open meeting laws. And so these are going to be transparent for you. These are going to be made available to you, and it is your right to know. So next. And you don't even have to physically be there. Many of our school districts now have the ability to stream their businesses, their meetings, and committee meetings online. So often you're able to hop on with anticipation to be part of those meetings online. And if you miss it, you can also you're often able to access archived videos after the meeting. So next. So if you're asking, what is my school board doing? What are they up to? Sometimes you find out about the decision of a school after the fact, but because these agendas are posted online, that's something that you can do today. Actually, today you can go into your own school district, to find what their agendas are, what their policies on important things like student groups, like you've heard today, book bans, third-party enforcements of immigration, their school data practices, and other regulatory measures. These are all things that you can find right now by going on their website to find out what that is. But let's say all you heard today, and looking through that website seems like a lot, and you're feeling like you need more space and more info to prepare. Well, we're here to support you, and we want to invite you to a community of activists called the School Board Watch. So next. So not only do we want to prepare you as a leader, but we want you to know that you have the ACLU's back. You have the backing of many partners in this movement. As you heard from Catherine and Terry, there's a lot to be doing here, and there's a lot to be concerned. As you heard from Nikki, there's a lot to be doing. There's a lot to be active in, and taking action right now is going to require partnership. And this is us attempting and hoping to partner with you today. And we want to say, if you do decide to join us today and you do find the violations, we also want to invite you back, because we are setting up through our reporting a system of reporting that if you do see violations in your school, it will be a direct line to the ACLU to report back any types of constitutional violations or concerns that you may have as someone being part of the School Board Watch. So we invite you to the next meeting, which is November 11th at 7 p.m. This will be virtual again, to hear more about how exactly you can be reporting back to us, how you can engage more. And I know there's probably a lot more questions. I can see that there's a lot of questions, but we want to make sure that you feel as prepared as possible. But also, we want to connect with you in a setting that is related to your own school district. So mark your calendars, November 11th. We want to make sure we see you back, and we'll go over more of this information then. So thanks, Catherine. And if also we want to drop a link, Haley, I don't know if you can drop it in the chat, but we have a link for y'all's to sign up and get more information about it. So I'll drop that, and and turn it back to y'all for any questions.
Okay. So first question is for Terry. The Moorhead School Board doesn't allow public comments unless it's about an agenda item. The agenda is not published until the day before or later. You have to disclose what you want to tell ahead of time. I emailed all school board members individually, and half the board didn't even reply, and only one member, Lori Lee, was the only one who was for allowing public comments. The Alternative Learning Center is 60.1 students of color, but the Moorhead High School is 88% white. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, and thank you for the questions. First of all, it sounds like, yeah, there are some serious issues in the Moorhead schools. So there are some common myths about school boards and the open meeting law. The open meeting law requires notice of meetings, and that can be done by just publishing a general schedule of regular meetings and then advance notice of any special meetings. The open meeting law does not require publishing an agenda in advance. That is a best practice, and good governance and transparency really does counsel for publishing agendas far in advance and getting public input. But some school districts don't want to hear from the public. And so, the solution is really making sure they hear from the public about their desires for more transparency at the school board. The public open meeting law, there's no law or even First Amendment rules that would require government bodies to have a public comment period. Again, it's best practice. It is good governance for them to do that. And many school boards do have a public comment period that's much broader than what it sounds like Moorhead is. And once they do create a public comment period, right, they can set rules for it because they can set the decorum of the meeting, but they can't punish you because they don't like what you have to say. Right. So the Moorhead School, if their published rule is that you can only comment on matters that are on the agenda, that's the rule, and that's an okay rule for them to have under the First Amendment, unfortunately. But again, these are political bodies, and they need to hear from constituents about why they should be more transparent.
And the next question comes from Kristen Helling. What about students who want to wear buttons that say marriage is between a man and a woman? Is that allowed? Who wants to take that one?
I can take it. Yeah. Yes. I mean, Terry talked about the fact that really your First Amendment rights in school, the limit on them is whether what you're wearing or the messages that you're saying are going to disrupt the education of the people in your school community. And so different schools will have different thresholds for what that disruption, what the level of, when it meets that level. But certainly if a school is allowing students to wear buttons that say that, everyone should be able to marry who they want, then they would also, have to allow buttons that say marriage is between a man and a woman, I would think.
Great. Thank you for that, Catherine. And then from David McKinney, it says, so practically speaking, in what ways can students lawfully express support for LGBTQ plus classmates and their rights? How can they be strong allies?
I suspect Catherine will have some things to say too, but I'll jump in and say there are so many things. Form a gay-straight alliance, right? The First Amendment allows you to have student clubs. The Equal Access Act gives you the right to the same access as other student clubs. So form a gay-straight alliance and use the channels of communication that you have to send those affirming messages. Wear t-shirts that are affirming, wear clothing, wear buttons, speak out, even in the classroom context, if the discussion is appropriate, you have the right to articulate your viewpoint about affirming the rights of LGBTQ plus kids, right? If you're in a math class, for example, probably not, right? But if you're in a social studies discussion and the issue is germane, absolutely, you've got the right to do that, and you can't be punished for your viewpoint. Go ahead, Catherine. I'm sure there's.
Well, no, I think that's great, Terry, and I would echo all of that, and I would just add that I think there's a lot of power for allies on all of these issues, and so whether it's a student at school or whether it's a student or family or community members at the school board level, standing up for anybody who's being targeted, builds power for them and for your whole community. And so I think that's really important.
Okay, thank you for that. And then the next question we have, I'm just going to go down the list and try to lump some of these together. This one is also an LGBTQ plus question, and they kind of go together. The first question is, what happens if parents don't want their child to use the name they identify with? And how are we dealing with so many people being against trans people from participating in athletics for their genders team? And these are big questions. I want to frame it that way. So who wants to? You want to go, Catherine?
I can start. I think, it's really important, I think, to assert our rights and continue to assert them and assert the rights of those around you, even when they're under siege, especially and most importantly when they're under siege. And so as these attacks are happening, the way that we can file a lawsuit, we can assert rights in court, and that's an important place to do it. But it is also just really important that your administrators and your school district and your your state representatives, but we're talking about school boards tonight, but that they hear from you, that you care, that you want Minnesota to continue to be a place that respects our transgender community members and our transgender youth, and that is part of how we keep the laws. We keep that protection when we are in this unfortunate and really kind of dark time in terms of these attacks.
Well, I will just add specifically with regard to, what we're seeing with school boards and school board members who are reacting to the Trump administration's directive to Minnesota, is that we will continue to reiterate what the law currently is. Right. And no court at this point has said that what we're doing in Minnesota, our protections for trans girls in sports, no court has ever said that that's wrong. And we firmly believe that schools have obligations in Minnesota. They're important obligations. It's the right thing to do. And we will continue to talk about that and reinforce that. And stay tuned on more public statements from us about that.
And I would just add on that, there is litigation that's been going on, in Minnesota federal courts and about this issue, but the cases, there are two cases at the Supreme Court of the United States, that will get argued in January this year, this coming January, on this issue of transgender participation in sports consistent with a person's gender identity. And the way that the issues are framed at the Supreme Court, the question that is being presented is, if it is answered directly, it will determine whether laws that want to prohibit transgender participation in sports consistent with gender identity are a violation of Title IX or the federal Constitution. And a decision on that issue will not prohibit Minnesota from having laws that require inclusion. So finding that there's a lower, if that happens, that there's a lower floor of protection at the federal level, all the more reason that our state protections, that we should embrace them and pursue them, and they will still stand, hopefully.
And then this is a definition question, Terry, that I think you can take. What is the definition of a secondary school? Do they define the grades
Yes.
associated with secondary?
Yeah, so the Equal Access Act says a secondary school is essentially grades 7 through 12 or an equivalent range. So I would have to dig a little bit deeper into the case law on whether or not there's any additional things, but yeah, grades 7 through 12 are typically considered to be secondary schools. I just want to, since I was the one that talked about open meetings and public comment, I also wanted to respond to another question that's in the Q&A, Haley. And it is about a school district that requires people to provide word for word what they're going to say in advance, and they can be denied if the school district doesn't like what's being said. That's kind of depending on how the policy is written and how it's applied, it might be okay, but that sounds hinky and a little problematic. So if that person who commented wants to reach out and fill out an intake form on our website, we can take a deeper look at it. It's hard to answer that question without actually seeing the rule, but you know, the school board, again, if they're going to allow public comment, they can't pick and choose what, you know, what viewpoints they want to hear or what things they want to hear.
And so this one, I think, is another one that you can kind of address because I think it will be answered by intake as well. We're back in the Moorhead School Police needs to inform police about every fight, but this high school only enforces this policy for BIPOC children. This just so what can be done that they're only selectively applying this rule.
Yeah, again, I think that's probably something for a deeper intake to look more closely at, but you know, schools should all have neutral rules that are enforced even-handedly, and not in discriminatory ways. And so again, you know, the devil's all so often in the details and the specifics of the individual case. So I can't say whether or not this violates the Constitution or not, but it is certainly troubling to hear. So yeah, again, those kinds of things are things that I would encourage filling out our intake form.
And then Catherine, we have another question to clarify when you were talking about the rights of LGBTQ plus students and we were talking about the rights of BIPOC and immigrant students. Do these rights that we reference apply to all students? Or only can certain students exercise these rights?
Depends on the right. So when we're talking about our Human Rights Act, there are protections in our Human Rights Act that are specific to protected classes that have been identified. And, you know, they're really, that's, you know, protection from discrimination and harassment with, you know, I think an eye towards, you know, populations that are can be marginalized or have been victims of discrimination. But you know, the First Amendment and the Equal Access Act are laws that you know, those are rights that apply to everybody. So it you know, so it depends. But yes, many of them are. But we do have some laws that are specifically created to provide protection to those who may need it.
So this one's an interesting one that I don't think I've seen before. Can you express your values, free speech, while teaching in school? For example, can you wear pro-feminism buttons or t-shirts, women's reproductive rights, disability rights, and other human rights?
So the speech of government employees, of teachers while they are in the classroom, is much more constrained than the speech of government employees, speaking out on matters of public concern in the community. Right. When you're in the classroom, the school has a much stronger ability to regulate speech. And we typically don't represent government employees and their speech issues, so I don't have deep expertise on this. But the general rule is that when public employees are speaking in the community on matters of public concern, they have the right to do that as long as that speech is not interfering with the mission of the school. And so, that means teachers do have the right to speak out about curriculum rules at a school board meeting, for example. But the standard is very similar to the Tinker standard of disruption, right? The rights of public employees are not protected as strong as the rights of other community members in the community.
Thank you for that. I'm looking through, making sure. Chris, thank you for those resources that you popped in here. You can definitely send them directly to us if you would like. Can school boards make changes without notifying anyone of those changes? Like, do they have to have like a public session if, for example, they do change their opt-out rules or their book screening policies?
So it depends, right? This school districts typically have rules for how they make changes to policy, and the process that they go through. And there might be some emergency rules for making those changes. But again, the open meeting law is really more about making those changes in public, and it doesn't necessarily require advance notice so much as doing it in public where people can hear about it. And so they can't just sort of make changes to policies that have been adopted without, adopted in a public meeting without adopting those changes in a public meeting. But they typically have their own procedures for how to make those changes. And if they're not following those, that could be an issue. But otherwise, they can make changes without giving people advance notice, for example, unfortunately, which is why, having community members on the ground watching those school board meetings is so critical for us because we don't hear about it. Nikki talked about how she hadn't really heard about what was happening until it was almost too late. It was, the die was cast. And so we need people to be watching those school board meetings and letting us know what's happening.
And I just dropped in the chat some links for everybody. The first one is Learn, so that takes you to our campaign page on our website. The second one says Join School Board Watch, so that will take you to a form that you can fill out that then we can help activate you. And once you do join the School Board Watch, I really encourage you to sign up for our next meeting, which will be November 11th. It will also be a virtual meeting, but it will be a virtual meeting versus a webinar. Another question that just came in, how and where do schools have to post or list books that have been removed? Does it need to be included in the school board meetings, for example?
So the book ban statute, the requirement is to report book challenges and how they were resolved. And the reporting actually goes to the Department of Education. I have noticed that a number of school boards have started including them in like a superintendent's report. And so they may be something that you can find on your school board website in their agenda materials. But if you can't, and you want to find out if there's something happening in your district, there are two ways you might do that. One is the first thing I would do is write to my superintendent and say, hey, have you reported any book challenges to the Department of Education? And if you have, can I see them? They would, I think, most superintendents would respond to that and give them to you. There also, that's something you also can ask for through the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act. And that's something that certainly I could see that being a good topic for a school board watch meeting, how to do that if people were looking for documents. And the other people that I think collect those reports are the Minnesota Library Association Intellectual Freedom Committee. And I believe that you could locate them on the Minnesota Library Association website, and they could provide you with reports from all the school districts.
Okay, and I think on that note, friends, thank you for all your questions. As was said at the beginning of the meeting, I will be sending out the recording of this meeting, as well as the links that I put into the chat and the slides that you all saw today so that you can have those with you. They also will be placed on our webpage where we are hosting this campaign. I just want to thank you all for sticking with us for that hour-and-a-half long meeting, a little bit more, hour and 40 minutes, especially around the supper time. And I just thank you all for standing with us. Thank you all for being willing to organize and fight alongside us. You know, things may seem very dark right now, but together we are strong. And together we can make change happen and protect the rights of students throughout the entire state of Minnesota, but be example to the other states in this nation. And with that, good night, and until next time. Bye, friends.
Thank you.
Thank you.